Welcome back to the program. We are joined again by Ian Proud, a former British diplomat who served as the economic counselor at the British Embassy in Moscow between 2014 and 2019. And thank you for coming back on the program.
It's always good to talk, Glenn.
So you recently wrote an article about the bad boy of Europe, referring to the Belgian Prime Minister. And the context is that the European Union seems to have run out of money to finance the war in Ukraine. That is, the Ukrainian economy itself seems to be bankrupt, and continuing the war is increasingly costly indeed, now that the US is positioning itself to make money instead by selling weapons instead of giving it. It's becoming even more costly. So the EU seems to have its approach is to find a legal pathway to essentially steal the Russian sovereign funds. Again, there's been written a lot in Politico about this as well. That is looking for a way to use, I guess, Russian funds as collateral, trying to make theft legal, which is why many have referred to it as legalizing theft. What kind of schemes are the Europeans looking at in order to take the assets of Russia?
So the plan is, as I understand it, to actually use the 140 billion in Euroclear and Belgium to kind of back a loan of the same amount of 140 billion to Ukraine, called a reparation loan. But of course, it won't be used for reparations; it'll be used to continue the war. Friedrich Merz has said that with this money that Ukraine could keep fighting for another 2 or 3 years. I frankly don't believe that Ukraine actually can keep fighting for 2 or 3 years, even with the money. But nevertheless, that's what they packaged it as is another lie. It's a reparations loan, which it clearly isn't. It's a war fighting loan. But that then poses huge legal risk to Belgium itself. Belgium hosts Euroclear, hosts SWIFT as well, by the way. But and Belgium has an extant investment treaty with Russia, the Belgo-Luxembourg Russia investment treaties, which means that if they allow and sanction the expropriation of these assets, even if you try and dress it up and say it's kind of backing a loan, it's not the assets themselves, then Belgium will be subject to a wave of Russian litigation. There are existing oligarchs, Russian businessmen, who already have litigation against neighboring Luxembourg for $8 billion that were seized after the war started. And they're claiming for 16 billion, including damages. While Belgium's saying, well, 140 billion could then turn into 280 billion if the Russians not only litigate us for the return of the assets, but also then apply damages to that as well. And they're saying, well, why should we accept that legal risk? And the best thing for us is that European member states, and this was upon a recommendation of the European Central Bank Chairman Christine Lagarde, will be for European states to kind of guarantee a part of that money should we lose a court case and have to pay the money back to Russia immediately. And of course, to use Bart de Wever's words, that proposal that European member states say, well, okay, we'll pay X percentage of this money if a court case is won, was not met with a tsunami of enthusiasm. In other words, France in particular, I should think, Germany was saying, well, actually, that exposes us then to massive financial risk as well. And of course, they don't want to do it because the whole point of the loan was to ensure that European member states didn't have to pay themselves when they're cash strapped, when their economies are deindustrializing, when France can't keep hold of the government for more than a few weeks because of the size of its debt. Italy has a massive debt as well. Who's going to provide this money? So the Belgians are blocking it, saying, well, without these guarantees, well, it's too big a risk for us.
There's also a wider problem, though, that is besides the possible court cases, which is if the EU wants to be a place where people place their money, how much trust can there be if one kind of breaks this rule? However, one also see other countries, be it Japan, the United States, they seem to be very comfortable with the Europeans jumping on this grenade, but they they certainly don't want to be a part of this. They don't want to seize the funds.
Yeah, I mean, Japan has said no, and Deweyver talks about that in his speech. They said there's no precedent for this. It's, central bank assets, which is essentially what these are immune and should be immune. This didn't even happen after the end of World War II. So Japan has refused. The Americans are staying quiet, and there are other, apparently 6 EU member states that also have frozen Russian assets. I should think France. I should think Germany. I should think the Netherlands. I should think Ireland. Just plucking these names out of the air. I should think Luxembourg, for example. They'll all have frozen Russian assets, and they're not offering to kind of use those assets to back any loan to Ukraine. They're staying quiet. So essentially, Belgium is saying, well, we have maybe less than 50% of all of the frozen Russian assets. Well, we have to take 100% of the risk here, and we're simply not prepared to do that. And you're right, of course. More broadly, who will trust in Euroclear again? After this, will the Chinese, given that Kaya Kallas wants to go to war with China next? No. Will the Indians, will the Middle Eastern sort of Gulf states, for example, they'll be very much worried by this. Euroclear has trillions in reserves, from other countries that essentially belongs to to other countries. While those countries will say, well, maybe we'll use different financial architecture instead and just avoid Europe altogether because it's too big a risk.
That's my concern, though. Even discussing this so openly, looking at ways of making this seem legal, it can't fuel a lot of trust around the international system, given that they're working so hard on trying to find a compromise to do this. So even if they fail at seizing the Russian funds, uh, it's not for the lack of trying. And you see, it's yeah, that in its own, it just seems like so much self harm. Uh, but there is an interesting legal aspect here, though, which is the Europeans are already taking the interest of the Russian assets,
Yeah.
but not the main. Like, how is that? How does that fall within yeah, existing rules and international law?
Well, I mean, that exposes them to a significant legal, maybe not as great a significant legal risk as actually using, the assets themselves, because in normal circumstances, these assets sort of zip in and out on a daily basis. They don't really tend to sit there for any period of time, even though at any one time there's several trillion sloshing around in Euroclear. It's coming and going all the time from different countries. Each transaction is never really staying long enough to kind of gather interest. So I mean, that's a legal loophole which I think the European Commission has exploited. It still has significant legal risk. As you say, it still has a chilling effect on other investor countries, in particular China, but also Middle East Gulf countries and BRICS countries, more generally. But it's that's just the small bite of the chicken. To use a kind of Barter-Weaver term, he refers to this money as a big chicken that's kind of gradually being eaten away. So yeah, I mean, it has a big chilling effect, I think, longer term on Europe as the global financial architecture shifts east and moves very much more towards Asia, which is going to be the center of economic gravity in the 21st century.
Yeah, the fact that they reached kind of this consensus that we can freeze the money of any country and then take the interest of their assets. This is now falls
Yeah.
within what is seen as being legitimate and legal. This will be very concerning how it doesn't meet any real opposition. Again, if I was sitting in China, I would be very worried, especially as they will now seen one of their companies being seized in Netherlands.
Yeah,
Again,
exactly.
without trust in economics, there's nothing really there, though. But beyond the legal way, in terms of suing for the Russians, that is, how can they otherwise retaliate? Well, I mean, what is it that is fueling concerns in places like Belgium?
Well, they can retaliate, according to Belgium's prime minister, by seizing European assets still in Russia, including reserve assets, but also including European companies that still have a footprint in Russia. And I think there are still some, even though they operate under shell, companies. They could be expropriated too, which is obviously a big risk, kind of countermeasures. But I mean, I tend to think that the Russians are fairly relaxed on this. I mean, that they have now reserves of 700 billion, more than 700 billion US dollars. Okay, 300 billion of that is parked, but they have a big, pot of reserves. They can afford to sit back and watch this all play out to Europe's detriment. I think Russia wants the money back. It absolutely kind of wants the money back, but it's in no hurry. And, the Europeans know that if they can't do this by the end of this year, Ukraine will run out of money to fight the war, and there's no plan B. So I think in terms of the game of chess, Putin against a team of 28 people on the other side of the board, talking loudly for months and years on end before taking suboptimal decisions. I think Putin feels that he's in the strongest position, right now. Yes, there are countermeasures that he could take and probably would take. But if this falls through by the end of December, then Ukraine is in trouble financially.
This rhetoric you mentioned that Russia's written this off, it can be interpreted in many different ways because I see it as, the Russians to some extent think that the Europeans will hold on to this money forever, never release it.
Yeah.
But it seems to be interpreted more creatively within the EU by some saying that, well, they've written it off. They would be comfortable with the Europeans seizing it and using it to finance the war. But Russia having written it off in terms of not expecting to see any of it anytime soon doesn't mean that they won't fight tooth and nail to get something back from this, though.
Yeah, I mean, being prepared to wait is not the same as writing it off. I mean, the Weaver was clear that the messages they get from Moscow is that Russia wants the money back. But the point is that the Russia can have a bit more strategic patience about when he gets the money back, but it definitely wants the money back, of course. But all the time this kind of game plays out is actually hurting Europe more than it's hurting Russia because of the strength of Russia's reserves over and above what has been, frozen by Western nations. So it's just a game of patience, really. I mean, I do agree with you that Russians will believe that the Europeans don't want to give them back the money ever. I mean, that's very clear. I mean, in the same way that they think that the Europeans never want to end sanctions on Russia. Now, that's undoubtedly the view, in Moscow, but, the tide will eventually have to turn because events will take it in that direction as Ukraine runs out of money, has to settle for peace, and the sanctions which are holding the kind of freezing in place will be lifted at some point, and the money will have to go back anyway. And there will be no clever ruse to kind of settle that. I mean, even if some form of Trump's peace plan in Ukraine is agreed, the money would still, under those circumstances, have to go back to Russia first, and then there'd be some decision about how reparations were dealt with after.
Well, whatever loan it would be, it seems clear that the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to pay it back. But so within Europe, there's talking about the idea that eventually this would have to be paid by the Russians. That is, the money which has been seized, the Russian would have to accept that this would be part of a post-war deal. It would have to be reparations. So the Russians would have to pay reparations to Ukraine. Now, given that the Russians are winning, this seems unlikely that the EU would be able to dictate the terms in terms of the Russians seizing these funds. But it's just strange to me because the EU could, in a more productive way, put the return of these funds in a proposal to have some leverage over the Russians as, I guess, a carrot in order to get some more favorable deal for Ukraine in a peace deal. But taking the money, this would almost make it difficult for the Europeans to end the war, wouldn't it, if they already dipped into all the Russian money?
Well, it's not clear the Europeans want to end the war anyway. I mean, there's still this head in the sand ostrich mentality where they believe that they can keep carrying on doing what they've been doing for the last 11 years, and eventually Russia will buckle, even though there's no evidence that Russia Russia will buckle. So I mean, there's deluded thinking, particularly in Brussels, Kaya Kallas and others, about this. But you're right that if they just appear to give the impression, which is what they're appearing to do, that they want to just keep the money anyway, well, Russia will keep fighting. I mean, that's been clear for a very, very long time. So I mean, at some point, European leaders then have to bite the bullet that Ukraine can't keep fighting the war, forever. It just will run out of people as much as anything else. And Europe can't fund the war forever because it has no money. And if it can't use the Russian money, then that means that Ukraine is bankrupt, and Ukraine doesn't pay back loans anyway. So at some point, a crunch point is going to be reached where people have to face up to that. I suspect if this 140 billion deal isn't agreed by December, and it might not be, then that will kind of force the issue on the European side that actually, well, Ukraine needs another $60 billion next year just to stay afloat militarily. 2/3 of its budget goes to the military effort. If Ukraine can't agree 140, that means European member states between them, including, of course, the UK, as an outsider, are going to have to stump up $60 billion, and they don't have $60 billion out of their own pockets to give.
It's the worst possible time as well, given the economic problems across the continent. But why go down this path to begin with, though? Because as you said, if it seems if they seem dependent on keeping the war going, but obviously the money's not there to keep the war going, and even if the money was there, you can't resolve the manpower problem, which is at the heart of the the Ukrainian problem. So, what is the objective here? To buy a little bit more time, but then wouldn't that weaken Ukraine as well as the Europeans faster than they could hope of weakening Russia? It's unclear what the strategy ahead would be, though.
Well, I don't think there is a strategy, and I think that is the point, isn't it? That the Europeans have no strategy. They're stuck in a total victory delusion where they believe, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that they can secure total victory over Russia in this war, even though Russia is able to deploy a fairly low tempo by Russian standards, attritional warfare against Ukraine without suffering significant social and economic consequences at home. So I mean, any rational observer can see that the tide isn't in Europe's favor, and it's certainly not in Ukraine's favor. But people are clinging on to this total victory delusion because when the war ends, they've got to explain to voters in Europe why they said for all this time that they'd deliver a total victory over Russia, and they weren't able to do that. So I mean, there's that huge political peril involved for European leaders that French and Polish elections in 2 years, German and British elections in 4 years. In that bit of time, they could see their internationalist, kind of globalist government swept from power, replaced by nationalist, governments. And rather than suing for peace now and giving themselves a bit more time to explain away their failure to their voters, they're just clinging for time.
Yeah, I remember I warned all the way back in beginning of 2022 that this narrative of a unprovoked invasion, that this was is going to come back and bite us, because implicit in this, of course, if it's unprovoked military adventurism, then if that's the case, the only peace would be won on the battlefield, and indeed any diplomacy and compromise would be seen as treason or appeasement. So it seems that this has made it harder for the European political elites to walk away, or walk away some of their hardest rhetoric, but instead, they're losing a war, and they don't even want to pick up the phone and call Russia. It's quite extraordinary. But as you said, it's not just a military problem, economic problem, but the political is growing, though, with these anti-war movements having more, getting more and more support. Do you have any? I guess a final question. Do you have any predictions how this is going to play out? Because it's I guess if you look at all the different variables, from the military, the economic, and the political support, we seem to be it seems to be coming to an end. Do you see how this is going to work? What would break first?
I see it's coming to a fairly messy end for Ukraine, and actually, it's slightly slower time for European leaders as well. I think increasingly there's going to be a pressure within Ukraine to end it, particularly after Pokrovsk, has fallen. There'll be internal maneuverings, I think, to replace, Zelensky, or to force him to can hold presidential elections. I think that pressure is going to start to increase as the polling numbers continue to go in favor of a negotiated end to the war. A negotiated end to the war will be disastrous for Zelensky. He knows that. That's why he's clinging on for power, but he won't be able to hold that position forever. And if he can't get the money from Europe, he's not going to get it from the US or any other country. Then he'll run out of money, and he will be forced to sue for peace. So, I mean, I think the Europeans may conjure up some sort of deal to give them 60 billion to fight into next year, but I think the facts on the ground will increasingly turn against Zelensky at home, and he may be forced to settle, lose his office, get flown out by the Americans, put up in Stanford or somewhere like that, in terms of sinecure, or and that's how it will end. And I think longer term, politically, for European leaders, it's going to lead to Alliance Nationale government in Assemblée Nationale government in France, possibly a reform government in the UK in 4 years' time. Merz having a one term in office. The Poles kind of losing their grip, and the Security and Justice Party there, regaining power, and it kind of shift very much towards a more sort of anti-war, more sort of moderate nationalist governments of the type that we've already seen, of course, in Italy.
Well, so if there was a negotiated peace, though, it could be organized around a common European security. It could actually lay the foundation for having more stability in the putting an end to the past 30 years of conflict with the Russians. If it ends with the collapse of Ukraine, though, then it looks as if it will become a very messy peace. That is, the Russians will just impose a settlement which they're not reliant on trust or any agreements. They're simply, I guess, seizing the territories they want and putting into place a government they might like. It doesn't look like this will be any peace and stability on the continent over the next years if this is how the whole game ends, though.
It doesn't look good for Ukraine, facing a peace now, but several years, I should think, of negotiations about joining the EU, and maybe then joining the EU on second-class terms to other existing member states because of blockages from Poland and France in particular on subsidies and that. And that sort of thing, leaving a disgruntled population feeling they've been cheated of their European aspiration. Leaving a demobilized army of 1 million people who've, sacrificed so much for, half cooked offer of European membership from the EU. So, I mean, I think Ukraine itself is going to be in political crisis and social crisis for some time, to come, having the aspiration of Europeanness, but not the reality, and not the economic benefits, at least not immediately. So I think for Ukraine could be a source of conflict in Europe long after the war with Russia actually ends. I see no appetite for some sort of security architecture for Europe. I mean, the distrust on both sides, Russia and Ukraine and Europe, of course, is so great that unless there's a radical change in political leadership in Europe, which is not going to happen in the next kind of 2 years at least, that suspicion will prevent any sort of approachment with Russia, but will end up with an uneasy peace with Ukraine more fragmented than it's ever been since the end of the Soviet Union, I'm afraid to say.
Also, with the European bankrupting themselves, I mean, we're going to have a very difficult time after the war. That is, Ukraine's infrastructure has been destroyed. Its economy is in shambles. The ability to rebuild Ukraine after this is going to be very, very limited. Also, with the lack of workers. So it's
Yeah. And the irony is that if Europe decided to actually kind of if not have a political rapprochement, have an economic rapprochement with Russia, they could actually help turbocharge their growth by having cheap energy. I mean, that's far too rational a policy choice for the current crop of Europeans, I'm afraid. The hatred of Russia, the Russophobia is so great that the idea of improving their economies with the help of Russia is just so disgusting to people that even though it makes complete economic sense, they still won't want to do it. So, unless there's a big sea change in Europe, which I don't really see happening until about 4 years from now, we're going to still be in a phase of deindustrialization. And as you say, have the contingent liability of having to kind of, prop up Ukraine's reconstruction without the subsidies that other member states receive.
Yeah. Well, they keep almost celebrating this ignoring pragmatism as being principled and holding on to values, but you can only ignore your national interests for so long before new political forces begin to emerge who seeking to correct
Exactly.
this, and you can't really control them all the time. And it looks
Exactly.
we might be reaching a breaking point as well, as
I hope we are.
European politics seems very broken. So
Yeah. But I mean, I think I have some hope in the kind of moderate nationalist movements that want to, firstly, live in peaceful coexistence with other states. But also in terms of their policies, want to put their nations first in terms of their domestic energy, economic policies, and so on. Because foreign policy starts and ends at home. And I think one of the failures of this war is that people have forgotten that actually, if you're not looking after your domestic interests, then eventually your foreign adventurism will eventually kind of bite you politically at home. Foreign policy starts and ends at home. That's the big lesson, I think, from this war, that so many people have forgotten that to their detriment.
yeah. I've been saying for more than 20 years that redividing the continent and remilitarizing the dividing lines on the continent is gonna end very badly for Europe. It was always dismissed as, oh, that's a pro-Russian argument, but I think it's gonna be very clear that this is not in our interest to divide the continent in this way. Anyways,
Indeed
thanks
not.
again. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, just on that point, I mean, really, the European Union grew and became a success by and I've said this many, many times before. I'll continue to say this, but focusing on the economic, social, and cultural sides of interaction between states. And Europe has become far too politicized for its own good, and it's trying to create this kind of supranational, political body, which is inimical to the national interests of countries, and which erodes the potential from economic and social collaboration, which made Europe a success in the first place. And we need to get back to the basics of what made Europe work, including with Ukraine, but also actually with Russia, in terms of opening up socially, sort of, culturally, as well as economically. If we're going to have any peace on the mainland, we won't secure peace through political diktat from Brussels, that's for sure.
Wise words. Thank you, Ian.
Cheers, Glenn. All the best.